Louise Bedford here, your host of the Talking Trading podcast. This is how traders excel. Tired minds make awful trading decisions. Decision fatigue is the enemy of us all. Now, I have invited my friend Rik Schnabel to the show. Rik is definitely one of the most popular people that we have ever had on Talking Trading, and he is an NLP coach. He founded lifebeyondlimits.com.au, and with his specialty in neuro-linguistic programming, it's almost like this works magic on human psyche. So I have seen the trading results from the people who I've sent to Rik improve month on month, year after year. He has his own special brand of being able to use all of his knowledge to improve traders' results. So listen now, I know you're going to love it. Rik Schnabel, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Louise, and thank you for the invitation.
Rik, I want to start with the big question. How does decision fatigue screw up traders' results?
Well, I think if traders actually realized what the price of decision fatigue actually would be, I think they would put probably a great deal more effort in that particular area. For example, I saw a study in the US. Now, this is indecision overall, and they priced indecision just in the US at $650 billion a year. It's a massive figure, isn't it?
That is huge. Goodness me. And what do you think some of the common symptoms would be of decision fatigue?
I actually focus more in the mental space because it's a little bit like, Pareto's law, that 80-20 rule. And I believe that 80% of the problems, like once you know how to trade and you've been trained by people like yourself, so you know exactly the process of trading, the biggest issue is the mental space. So 80% of the problem is often the actual mental. And if we think about what does indecision usually look like, it's a little bit like, I can't work this out right now. Oh my God, is that the time? Or the floor needs cleaning, or something needs doing. So it moves very much into that distraction position. So if we think about it, when it comes to decision fatigue, what we normally fall into are things like confusion. And we all know confusion can be elements like overwhelm, having so many bits and pieces, chunks in the air that you can't actually work out what to do next. But when we start talking about the mental space, what often happens is we can bring about archetypes in that moment, such as the victim mentality, like I always get this wrong, or I'm not that great at this, boy, do I suck at this, or oh, here comes that same problem again. And I think they're the common issues with decision fatigue.
And with traders as well, one of the things that I've found is if you run your scan and it produces a list of 50 results, by the time you've hit maybe the 10th trade that you're looking at possibly taking, you are so scrambled, you can't remember which one is the most important one. You can't prioritize, and you've actually wasted your own energy because you've created a situation where there are too many choices. Yeah. I always find in situations like that, I can almost feel the energy leaking out of my body, and I'm pretty sure that could lead to burnout. What are your thoughts?
Look, absolutely. I mean, if we think of any particular thought that we might have, such as, I'm not feeling so good today, the thing that we have to understand is that, it is important how we feel, but it's more important how we feel about how we feel. And so when we begin to get a sense that we're feeling something and something's not right, of course, we know that our brain is very much a receiver. So what it does is it goes scanning for the data, and then it says, oh yeah, that's right. That last trade that I did went really, really pear-shaped. And all of a sudden it starts, lowering our breathing, and we're starting to breathe very, very low and shallow and perhaps fast. So we're starting to feel that level of anxiety, and before we know it, we're stuck in a bit of an anxiety loop. So what do we do then? We walk away from the trade. We
Yeah,
distract
or
ourselves.
we put on trades. We put on trades that are inappropriate. And I think that can happen too. Like I've definitely seen my traders think, well, I've got room for just one. I'm going to just choose anyone. And that can be a degradation of your own results as well. I think that we take it for granted that we think we're going to be sharp every second. And that, I believe, is not the case for traders. Some traders are more owl oriented. They operate very well at night. Others are more morning oriented. They operate very well in the morning. And there has been a study that if you put an owl into a lark position and a lark into an owl position, they will actually not only make less money, but they'll stuff up more. There'll be more mistakes. So I think that's what we're talking about here too with decision fatigue. It's systemic. It's representative of a broader problem that can actually impact a trader's results. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, it's very much along the lines when we think about getting tired, what we typically do is we move to our default position. And, fatigue is just another word for tiredness. We've just been running the game for just a little bit too long. And what happens is we fall into our default. It's a little bit like our game face that we put on if we're, going to jump on a stage and do a public talk or walk in an office. We put on a game face. But that game face usually requires a greater level of us. But when we're fatigued, it's much, much harder to be able to operate at our absolute best. So we've got to have some strategies to really pull ourselves out of that particular position, particularly when we're fatigued.
Yeah, I agree. Let's talk about those strategies now. What would be some of your top strategies?
Well, I think, we've heard a lot about breathing, and breathing definitely is very, very key to certainly how we function. But if you're sitting and you're about to do a trade, and what we've got to become is we've got to be conscious of the programs that are running in our unconscious brain. So, for example, if you put your hand on your shoulder and you put your other hand on your gut and you're sitting there and you're noticing, is your hand on your shoulder going up and down or is the hand on your gut going up and down?
Oh, that's good. That's really good. That gets you very conscious of an actual movement in your body, which I think is sometimes breaking that intellectual focus that we have to have. We have to always be thinking. But sometimes if we get back into our own body, that can really help.
And it's a little bit like understanding, like when we're in danger and you're making gut-based decisions, that's probably a smart thing to do. But when you're not in danger and you're breathing high and making gut-brain decisions, it's usually the absolute wrong thing to do. So, I mean, a lot of people say that we should make more gut-based decisions, but it's actually the wrong thing to do at different times. But it's like once we're at the level of gut, we are at a completely different level of state. So our state is going to determine our clarity of our thinking. Our state is going to determine our posture. Our state is going to determine everything. But it's also going to determine how we're functioning. Are we functioning visually? Are we functioning auditorily? Are we functioning kinesthetically? Or are we functioning from a breathing perspective? And each one of those is going to create completely different results. Like if our kinesthetic is really upsetting our breathing pattern and we're getting really, really nervous about what we're looking at or the decision we're going to do, or on your earlier point, saying, right, I've got to place a trade today and just kind of which one am I going to choose, then we're not at the best state.
And I think sometimes that can self-perpetuate as well. I've noticed, especially with mood tunnels, which is, I think this is a made-up term, okay, Rik, but the way that I think about it is that when my traders become euphoric, all of a sudden they're putting on 500 trades, whereas if they're sad and depressed, they can't see any decent trade at any stage. It's almost like that mindset is represented in the body, but we just have to pay attention to those signals first, which is why I love that. Is that an anchoring technique, that technique about putting your hand on your shoulder or your upper chest and your hand on your stomach and seeing that the breath is going into your lowest part of your belly? Is that an anchoring technique?
It can be turned into an anchoring technique, but technically it's not an anchoring technique. It's more an observational technique that gives us a sense of where we're breathing from. So if we're breathing up here in our lungs too much, we're going to typically mirror more of an anxiety pattern. But if we're breathing very deep and low, we're going to create a much better state. So in essence, just the process of doing that almost becomes a bit of an anchor.
Yeah, it really does. I think anchoring is so important. I'd love to hear your thoughts about some anchoring methods that you feel can help our traders.
So anchoring is a technique that essentially is creating a pattern and then being able to create a physical result of that particular pattern. Like, for instance, if I go running around the block really, really fast, I'm going to be breathing very rapidly. So immediately just that behavior is going to create a pattern of breathing. And then all my associations around that are going to determine whether my trading is going to be good or not. Now, I wouldn't recommend that. But if we think about, on your earlier point about, trading at a fairly calm level, then the pattern of anchoring is all we have to do is, sometimes it's easy to close your eyes and remember a time that you were very, very calm and at peace and feeling really good about yourself without feeling super excited or super low. It's kind of that middle point. And so what we do is our brain now starts to emulate that feeling through a memory. So our brain is going to cause our body to feel that way. So what we want to do, the anchoring process, is doing something like steepling your hands or bringing your hands together or placing your hands on your chest. It's almost like a physical reminder of that particular state. It's a little bit like, people who do this all of a sudden go into a praying pattern. People who meditate might get into a lotus position or something along that line. So it's actually the position that is almost as important as the actual state. So it's just helping our brain to remember that state. So what you could actually do is create a cycle of doing that around 3 times. Our brain learns in patterns of 3. So if you essentially remember a time you were really, really calm, and then steeple and hold that position for about 5 to 15 seconds. So what your brain is now doing, it's associating that memory of being calm with that steepling of your hands. So then you remember another time that you're really calm, do exactly the same thing. Remember another time that you were calm, do exactly the same thing. Then pull your hands apart and then test it. Like, for example, remember yourself at a time that you're really anxious or completely overwhelmed. And then what you do is bring your hands together, and if that feeling should completely dissipate and you start feeling more calm, then you have anchored. So that has successfully worked. So it's associative. It's very much associative. So the moment that we see through our own eyes, feel through our own body, it's very associative. And so that can be a really good way to create the right state. But if we're finding that we're anxious or we're not in a good state, then get disassociative. So see yourself in the picture rather than through your own eyes. So that creates that distance and that creates that disassociation. And in many therapies, they use that as a technique to sort of, calm people down or break their pattern.
Yeah, they do actually. And that is interesting what you're saying here, because there is a study about third person where I don't say to myself, well, I'm about to trade. Louise is setting about her day. She's getting ready to trade. She's going to trade effectively. So by creating that little bit of a distance verbally,
Yes.
that can actually give you that macro view and let you see yourself as if a god was looking at you, so that you can self-correct in time before things go spiraling out of control. I love that you mentioned that. That is so good. There's a lot of good science around that.
Also, just that point that you just raised, when you create disassociative sentences, Louise is about to trade really calmly, beautifully, wonderfully well. That can also happen when things go wrong. Like when things go wrong, don't say, oh my God, I mucked up, and then anchor your head, and things like this. Because you see this when people get stressed, they touch their head, they
Oh.
squint their eyes, they bring their chin down, and they're creating essentially a physical anchor. Like people are creating anchors every day, they just don't realize they're building them. It's a little bit like when you put your head up, your voice goes up. When you put your chin down, your voice goes down. And equally one's authoritative and one's more victim orientated and out of control. So physiology's got everything to do with it. But when you muck up, don't say Louise has mucked up. Say the boss has mucked up today.
Okay. So you are also assigning a persona.
Well, it's an archetype of position. Like the moment you call yourself the master or the boss, you are already in a much higher position mentally than saying I, Rik Schnabel, mucked up today, and then out comes your father, your mother, and then of course we start beating ourselves up as if our father or mother might.
I love that. Actually, I do hope that one of my traders who I just respect and admire, who's a running partner with me, a co-host of one of the shows that I'm on, Jordan Miller, is listening to this, because he has got an alter ego that he has to justify all of his trades to, called the boss. So
Yes.
the fact that you've actually touched on this is just awesome. I'd like to talk about some of the other practical things that we can do as traders. So, are there any self-talk techniques that perhaps you can take us through to help us adjust that? Because what you were saying there, where we can be very self-critical when something has gone wrong, generally hasn't helped traders' performance. So, I'd love your thoughts about some self-talk techniques.
Okay. Well, firstly, let's create a model. Firstly, we've got to think about baseline. So baseline, everything under baseline is all reality. So everything that you know is a fact. So then what we sometimes have to do is we've got to go above the baseline, and now we enter into the land of perception. So we have reality, and we can't help it. We're meaning-making machines. We make meaning of everything. So if we're in a situation that let's say we're about to trade, so what we're looking at is we're looking at so much reality, all the reality that we can find. And so if we have just one piece, if we come up from reality and we go to perception, because we're going to look at reality and we're going to ask ourselves, what does that mean? And then we're going to put a perception on that. And that might mean this is a green light or this is a red light. So that's one piece of perception. So if we just always stick with one piece of perception, what we're doing is we're training our brain to be very fixed mindset. So we're going to jump to conclusions very, very quickly, very, very easily. However, if we go up to a next perceptual piece and we look for some other data that says, wait a minute, I've seen this pattern before. Where have I seen this pattern before? And then we go into another level of perception. So now what we have is we've got essentially two choices. So instead of just one, we've got two choices. But if we move to a third, now we have very much an open mindset because we're looking from different perspectives to be able to make the same choice. However, if we start going to 4 or more, we move to confusion. So if we're looking for at least 3 points, 3 data points, okay, I'm about to make a decision here, and have some reference points as to what are your checklists to make those good decisions, and then look at it from different perceptions. So go above the line and look at 3 different perceptions. And that will cause you to certainly make better decisions. But if you find that you keep making just one perceptual position on a position that you're going to take, well, then you'll find that you might be making the same mistakes over and over and over again.
Yeah, I like that. There's a method that I'm quite enraptured with, where if I'm about to take a trade, I have to also justify it from the other trader's point of view that's going to be buying my position, for example, if I'm selling it. Because I used to go in the markets, Rik, honestly, it was just a bit narcissistic of me. I'd go, the other person on the other side of this deal is a moron. That's what I used to say to myself. How can they not see what I'm seeing? That is actually very counterproductive, of course. Yes. So what you're talking about is looking at the trade from different perspectives and coming out with an objective view. Now, there is something that I've been meaning to ask you about, and I do wonder whether this is one of the places where we may have a difference of opinion. It's actually, it happens sometimes, not very often with you, Rik, because I've known you for so long. My yoga teacher tells me to take a pause, just take a pause, let the feelings and emotions run through me, and then act. Okay, so I've tried to do this with my trading as well. But I do know that you have mentioned that then when there's a gap between creating an idea and fulfilling on it, that gap can be very detrimental. Now, I've got to say, I have been honor of the gap. I have been thinking that the gap is a good thing. Tell me why you think the gap is detrimental, and have I misinterpreted what you said?
Well, the very first thing, let's talk about the pause. Let's talk about the pause in a conversation. When there's a long pause in a conversation, you know the next thing that a person's going to say is probably going to be the most important thing.
Yeah.
So pauses are great. We all need some level of reflection. But if we elongate that just a little bit too far, we're going to get to a point of overwhelm, or we're going to get to a point where we start building very much a fear mentality. And it's a little bit between the point of making a decision and actually doing it. The wider that gap gets, the more allowance of fear can come certainly into that gap. So if we sit with decisions too long, it's not a case that a pause is a bad thing, because that's never a bad thing. We typically want to be able to reflect on our thinking, and we want to reflect on our behavior. But for certain things, there's an unnatural pause. For example, whenever I'm writing something, be it a video, a blog, a book, or whatever it might be, I like to have a 24-hour pause between writing chapters. So I'll write a chapter and I won't sign off on it until I've given myself 24 hours to just get out of my state, get back in a new state and have a look at it. Now, for example, in the context of a trade, there's going to be some elongated pauses that are going to be just building fear. That's all they're doing. It's a little bit like someone staying in the paper trade.
Yeah.
I mean, at some point, it's got to be a real life trade.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I do see some very overly analytical people who often in their role in their job or their business, they might be a data analyst or an actuary or somebody that's very detail oriented. Sometimes those types of people take a very long time to put on their very first trade. I remember my business partner, Chris Tate, he met one of the members of our mentor program at the opera at one stage, and he'd done the mentor program 12 years prior. he'd never even placed his first trade. He was an actuary, and he said, I just don't think everything's exactly perfect. Yes, so that can be a problem too. You just mentioned state-based. Tell me more about this state-based method of thinking, and how do you think traders can shift their physical state to enhance their mental clarity and their decision-making speed?
Okay, so the thing that I've come to understand over the years is that every thought you have is state-based. It's all state-based, and it's a little bit like a classic example of this is that you think about back in your high school, college, university days. When you get to the point of information going in, we're usually in a very passive, receptive sort of state. So we're listening, taking notes, observing, watching, and we're usually in a very calm state. So then we go into the exam rooms and we do our exams, our state shifts. So we create stress. Now, what stress actually does is there is a thing called chromatin, which sits above our DNA. It's like a sheath that our DNA sits in. And it literally, when we get stressed, it squashes our DNA. In other words, that's what becomes memory fog. That's what becomes, I can't think of that guy's name, and stops us from actually thinking. It's just because we're quite stressed. So when we're stressed and we go in the exam room, we're in a completely different state to the way that the data and the memories go in. Another classic example of this is like a person who gets depressed, their state is, let's call it a very low level state. So that's why it's sometimes hard to get people out of depression, because when they're in a low state, all of their past thoughts are very much in that state. All of their future thoughts are very much in that state. So what you've got to do is you've got to get them above that line to start moving in a different state. Then you can get their thinking beginning to change. So it's a little bit like a lot of people that, I've come across over the years say, I go to these Tony Robbins events and, and I feel so excited, and I come out and I can't remember jack, And the reason is because Tony revs them up, gets them into a high state, and these people are very seldom in that high state. So they can't remember the information at the level that it went in. And they just can't remember it because they don't allow their state to get into that particular realm. This is why it's so important to manage your trading state, because your trading state is key to everything. Because if you go in a high state while you're doing research, then you bring yourself to a low state when you're trading, how are you going to remember that research? So if you take in the data in a calm state and then you go back into trading in a calm state, then you'll remember the things that you need to remember. And you'll do the things that you typically do. It's a little bit like we act very differently contextually. We might be a certain person at a party, but we won't be that certain person on our own while we're at home, for example. So it's state-based is everything, because your state determines your thinking.
So if a trader is feeling a bit low, should they do some jumping jacks before they get to the computer? Well, is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, they need to do something to get themselves in what they might call a baseline state.
Yeah, equilibrium somehow.
Yeah,
I do like that, because often we're talking about traders needing to calm themselves down, but actually when you extend this state-based thought out, it could also be traders needing to rev themselves up.
Absolutely.
Yes.
If you think about it, every single trader is coming into a comparison environment. Everything's about comparison. Where was it yesterday? Where was it, a year ago? Where is it likely to go? It's in a comparison state. So a comparison state can be very, very judgmental in that context. So therefore, if we're very, very judgmental in that state, then we're likely to be quite judgmental of ourselves. So you could imagine someone could come into a trading state and they're looking at the markets and they're in that state of comparison. And then all of a sudden they might start jumping on themselves for a trade that went wrong. And before you know it, that 40-year-old, 30-year-old someone has devolved back to when they were 7 years old and everyone laughed at them at school for getting a question wrong.
Yeah.
So they leach. They energy leach. All of a sudden their energy goes, falls out of their body. And what happens as a result is their whole state devolves. That's not the right state to be training in at all.
And what you're tipping towards here as well is the stories that we tell ourselves, the power of the narrative. I know you've been interested in something that Rob Walker has explored, the researcher. So traders often craft a narrative that supports decisiveness and confidence in their trading activities. Tell me more about your thoughts about the narratives and the stories we create as traders.
Well, for example, in that context of the significant objects, where basically what they did is they got all of these objects and they bought them for, I think it was $200. They put a story on those objects and placed those same objects on eBay and they returned to $8,000. The value increased dramatically. Why? Because of the story. So stories are the things that we tell ourselves while we're very, very conscious, but those stories don't stop there. Those stories continue. Like if you think about it, there's kind of three levels that we've really got to master in that space. We've got the micro, we've got the macro, and then we've got the meta. So the micro and the macro, many of the people that I coach, particularly people that don't have a mentor and don't have someone to learn from, the first thing I'm going to say is go see Louise and Chris, because you need a model to work from. You need to have a really good model that you can say, yes, that's the trading that I want to do. That's the trading that I want to put down as the baseline where I want to get to, or actually an aspirational line. So that is essentially the micro and the macro. So I will often say to people, I want you to model Chris and Louise. Choose one of them and then model them and find out how they're trading. What are they trading? What are their patterns? What are their rules? And all of those sorts of things. But the piece, and this is going back to the 80%, the piece that often we have to do the most work is the meta, what is the thinking underneath the thinking? Like, why do we rush into a trade? And we might find that every time I rush into a trade, I don't follow my own rules. And when I don't follow my own rules, that's where I make the biggest mistakes. So we've got to get very clever to be able to get into the meta, the thinking that's underneath the thinking. And it's the thinking that's underneath the thinking that actually determines what we do. It's the behaviors. So many people look at the behaviors, but they don't think, what is the thinker thinking in order to create the behaviors? So that's where I would go.
Yeah, I really like that. Rik, I want you to tell everybody a bit more about your work, your books, and where people can find you, because really you are such a hidden gem. You are such a resource for our traders. So give us a little bit more information about you and what people should do next.
Cool. What I do is essentially I look at the meta. I want to find out, where do people want to go? That's question number one. Where do you want to be? Where are you now? And then my job is to find out why you're not where you want to get to. So that is looking at the meta programs that run how we think and how we behave. And the purpose of a lot of the coaching is to perfect that. Get that working so the trades start heading in the line that you really want them to. So I guess the best place to find me is lifebeyondlimits.com.au.
Absolutely. Rik, you are such a champion. I love that you share your views so freely. I know this is just the tip of the iceberg. So if you're thinking of exploring neuro-linguistic programming or perhaps even leveling up your trading game, Rik is the person to contact. Rik, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Louise.